You are welcome. This is the Messiah channel. We are looking at two memorials of affliction, two symbols of affliction of the Hebrew Israelites. The memorials are thousands of miles apart, one in the slave coast and the other one in the slave plantation. How the Gentiles afflicted the chosen of God. Is there any evidence of the affliction? And do they tell you who the chosen of God are? Looking at the afflictions, we are focusing on the slave dungeon in Elmina in Ghana and the Nottoway Plantation in Louisiana, United States. These locations are symbolic of the afflictions that the Hebrew Israelites went through, and the afflictions were prophetic. And we will read Deuteronomy chapter 28, verses 45 to 46 on the record. We read it on the record. Moreover, all these curses shall come upon thee, and shall pursue thee, and overtake thee till thou be destroyed, because thou hearest not unto the voice of the Lord thy God, to keep his commandments and his statutes which he commanded thee. And they shall be upon thee for a sign and for a wonder, and upon thy seed forever. The Lord was telling Moses that because his brethren did not obey the commandments of Elohim, curses will be imposed on them, and the curses will be so calamity. It will be cataclysmic, it will be calamitous, and it will be unprecedented. And it will serve as a sign and as a wonder that no doubt they are the chosen of God going through the afflictions. And there's no way for me to show the afflictions but to focus on two memorials, two structures, two buildings that symbolize the affliction of the Hebrew Israelites as predicted in the book of Deuteronomy. We are focusing on the Elmina Slave Dungeon in Ghana and the Nottoway Plantation in Louisiana, United States. And as I'm doing this video, I will draw a mental picture in your mind, and I will describe the journey of the afflictions, and I will call the phases of affliction. Phase 1 is the slave dungeons where the Hebrew Israelites were kept, and here we are talking about the Elmina Slave Dungeon built in Ghana in the year 1482. The slaves were stored in that dungeon, and that was the phase 1 of the affliction. And in phase 2 of the affliction, they were loaded on slave ships, and they passed through the Middle Passage, and they went through all afflictions aboard the slave ships. And you remember what happened in 1781 when a British ship engaged in massacre of slaves, enslaved Africans, enslaved Hebrew Israelites. They were thrown aboard the slave ship. It happened 1781, a British slave ship. They were going through phase 2 affliction, and they were subjected to all kinds of afflictions, including being subject to violence. And the slave ships, had instruments of torture that were used to torture the enslaved Hebrews, including instruments that were used to forcibly open their mouth so that they would be forcibly fed. And when they went on hunger strike, preferring to die rather than to be on the slave ship. That was phase 2 of the affliction. And in phase 3, after they landed in their destination or known destination, the New World and United States, in Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, and other places, and they were subjected to phase 3 afflictions. And the phase 3 affliction is continuing, has continued from plantation to prisons and to racial profiling, going on to this day, the day of making this video. And the memorial of affliction that I focus on today is the Nottoway Plantation, a building built in 1859 in a town called White Castle in Louisiana in the United States. Nottoway Plantation, a building built by John Hamden Randolph, a slave owner who held Hebrew Israelites in captivity on his slave plantation in White Castle, Louisiana, United States. So how do you compare the Nottoway Plantation in Louisiana with the Elmina Slave Dungeon in Ghana? You will say that the Elmina Slave Dungeon, that store that kept enslaved Africans, it was built 1482 by the Portuguese, Gentile Portugal, whereas the Nottoway Plantation was built by one person, John Hamden Randolph, a slave owner. Prophetically, whether you're talking about an individual, John Randolph, or you're talking about a slave trading nation, Gentile Portugal, we are talking about the Zachariah horns, the horns that scattered the children of Judah to all the four corners of the earth. And the carpenters will be coming to destroy the Gentiles, the horns that scattered the children of Judah. And judgment is coming. May 15th, 2025, there was fire that engulfed the Nottoway Plantation in the United States. The fire gutted the building, and a lot of people are saying that that is divine retribution. And of course, as the foundations of Nottoway Plantation was caught on fire, the Elmina Slave Dungeon is still intact in Ghana. It is renovated to preserve the memorial of affliction, the memorial of massacre of Hebrew Israelites who went through the afflictions, to serve as a sign and a wonder based upon Deuteronomy chapter 28, verses 45 to 46. Nottoway Plantation, notorious. No wonder in 1980 it was listed in the National Register of Historic Places. There's a national register in America that lists places that are historic in nature. And Nottoway Plantation was so listed in that book, National Register of Historic Places. And if you are comparing that with her sister building, the slave dungeon in Elmina. That dungeon was also listed by the United Nations to be among the World Heritage Sites. There are places in the world that are so important historically that they are preserved to be World Heritage Site. And so the Elmina Slave Dungeon in Ghana is a World Heritage Site, as Nottoway Plantation in Louisiana, United States, is also listed on the National Register of Historic Places. There are so many historic places in the United States, the White House being one of them, being a building, a structure, an office, a residence of the President of America, a structure built by free slave labor, symbolic of the slave labor that was used to build United States of America. And so the sisters, Nottoway Plantation in Louisiana and Elmina Slave Dungeon in Ghana, they are historic buildings, they are historic places. They serve as memorial of affliction, memorial of massacre. These are memorials indicating that what the Lord said about the Hebrew Israelites were actually fulfilled in Ghana, fulfilled at Elmina, fulfilled at the notorious slave dungeon in Elmina in Ghana, fulfilled thousands of miles away across the Atlantic Ocean in a town famously called White Castle in Louisiana, fulfilled in the form of a plantation, a building where a slave owner, John Hamden Randolph, kept his slaves, kept them in bondage, kept them in captivity, all because it has to serve as a sign and a wonder that the captives were the chosen of God and they are going through the punishment, the curse imposed on them by their Lord as decreed in the book of Deuteronomy chapter 28 verses 45 to 46. We are comparing Nottoway Plantation in Louisiana with Elmina Slave Dungeon in Ghana, formerly the Negro Land, formerly the Slave Coast, formerly the Gold Coast. And what comparisons come out? The comparisons are very clear, and here we're talking about the afflictions that went inside the two buildings, the Nottoway Plantation building in Louisiana and the Elmina Slave Dungeon in Ghana. Both places became tourist attraction, and people went there to visit what used to be a slave plantation in Louisiana, United States. And people always go to Ghana every year to visit what used to be the storage facility for enslaved Africans. The Gentiles came to Africa and they pretended they came to trade in gold and diamond and coffee and palm oil, but later on they turned into slave trade, and these enslaved Africans and put them on cargoes across the Atlantic Ocean, and some of them eventually went into Nottoway Plantation in White Castle White Castle, Louisiana, United States. And what went on in the slave dungeon in Elmina also went on in the Nottoway Slave Plantation in Louisiana in the United States. Rape went on in Elmina. Rape went on in Nottoway, Louisiana. People died and people were killed. They were killed. And they were killed like animals and they were treated like animals. And I don't know how I'll compare the Nottoway plantation with the Elmina slave dungeon in Ghana, but at least I'll focus on some of the extremes of affliction. And I'll start by looking at phase one affliction, the affliction that occurred in the storage facilities, the slave dungeons dotted in Africa, and Elmina slave dungeon being the most notorious because of the extremes of affliction and also because of the fact that it became the largest and the first in Africa. The memorial of affliction of Hebrew Israelites. What went on inside the Elmina slave dungeons? One, there was a condemned cell. If you go to the Elmina slave dungeon, they used to call it Elmina Castle. Of course, it's a castle for the European, but it's a slave dungeon for the Hebrews, the Hebrew Israelites. Condemned cell. The condemned cells were prepared, no light, no lightning inside, and people were put there. They were condemned because those are people who are going to be killed. They are going to be killed, and some of them will be tortured so that they will die, and some of them will not be fed so that they will die of hunger, and some of them will not be given water so that they will die of thirst. So anybody who is in the condemned cell was somebody who was awaiting to die at the hands of his captors, the Gentiles, the Portuguese, the British, the French, the Spanish, and many other horns, Gentile people that engage in affliction of the Hebrew Israelites. Apart from the condemned cell, at the Elmina strip dungeon, we had the rape chamber, the governor of the castle. When I say the governor of the castle, I'm talking about the Portuguese official who represented Portugal in managing the affairs of the Gold Coast. More or less, he became the president of Ghana because he was the representative of the Gentile power, Portugal. He had a special rape chamber. I visited the rape chamber, and there you saw African women, all of them naked, and the governor, a white man, you stand on his balcony, and then he will be looking at the bodies of naked African women, and he will be pointing to the ones that had to be brought up to his chamber to be raped. And if you refuse to be raped, the punishment is unthinkable. The women who resisted rape, they were chained naked to cannonballs, very heavy, and they were left in rain, in darkness, and they were not fed. They had to be tortured so that they would not resist the rape by the governor, the white Portuguese governor, the governor of the slave dungeon in Ghana, and the de facto president of Ghana, because Ghana was not independent. Ghana, the Gold Coast, was still under the tutelage of the Gentile powers, Gentile Britain, Gentile Portugal. The third significant memorial at the slave dungeon in Elmina Castle is the grave, human grave. The Atlantic Ocean bordering the dungeon served as a grave, mass grave for many, many people who were thrown into the sea. The sea became their cemetery. In the same way that the Hebrew Israelites who were aboard the slave ship, they had no cemetery. The ocean floor in the Atlantic Ocean, there beyond the rivers of Ethiopia, became their grave. They were put in mass grave, and so there was grave at the slave dungeon, and even at the graves there was segregation. White people were buried in a different place than the enslaved Africans, and some of them, they were buried in mass graves, and a lot of them were thrown into the sea. The Atlantic Ocean became the grave for the Hebrew Israelites, and that is the treatment, the affliction of the Hebrew Israelites as they were going through phase 1 affliction. I will skip phase 2 affliction, the affliction that they went through aboard the slave ship, and I will move to phase 3 affliction, and here I'll be focusing on Nottoway Plantation in White Castle, Louisiana, United States. The reason why I'm doing this video is that I was shocked to learn about the atrocities that were going on, or that went on, inside the Nottoway Plantation in Louisiana, in a town called White Castle. What a name! White Castle. Castle. The Elmina Slave Dungeon notoriously was called Elmina Slave Castle. So I'm talking about Nottoway Castle in Louisiana, Nottoway Slave Plantation in Louisiana, the building that caught on fire May the 15th, 2025. Rape went there. Enslaved Africans were shot and they died. But what is most striking, the mother of all affliction, is that it's reported slaves were killed, and not only that, their bodies were eaten by their captors, smoked and eaten. The tradition of eating the body of slaves, it went on in America. The tradition of eating the body of slaves, smoked as barbecue, the mother of all afflictions. And I'm not sure whether Moses anticipated that his brethren who will go to Egypt again in ships, they will be eaten as barbecue at happened in Nottoway Plantation in White Castle, a famous or infamous town in Louisiana, United States of America. Nottoway Plantation versus Elmina Slave Dungeon. Which one will be the symbol of atrocity? The most reckless, the most wicked symbol of affliction? Is it Elmina Slave Dungeon, where they had a condemned cell where people from the cell had to die? They were waiting the day of their death through starvation and through torture. Is it Elmina Slave Dungeon that is the most wicked center of affliction, where they had the rape chamber, where the governor raped African women, where African men were sodomized by Gentile Portugal, Gentile England? Is it Elmina Slave Dungeon, where Africans were humiliated? No toilet facilities. They defecated on themselves in the cell, denied food, denying place of convenience, and women went through humiliation as they did not have any sanitation, and their bodies were ruined. Their bodies actually went through so much humiliation, even including living with menstrual blood without any sanitation. Humiliation to the highest level. Affliction of the Hebrew Israelites. Is Elmina Slave Dungeon worse or better than Nottoway Plantation in Louisiana, United States, where enslaved Africans not only were raped, but they were killed, and their bodies served as meat, barbecue meat for the captors. So which one is the most wicked memorial of massacre? Which one will you condemn? Which one will you condemn most? Regardless of what you think, these are signs and wonder that Deuteronomy verse 46, chapter 28 said, and they shall be upon thee for a sign and for a wonder, and upon thy seed forever. It is a shame, it's an affliction. It is in the record books, history books. The Gentiles are trying to wipe it out. And so in Gentile America, they are trying to wipe out the history of the Negro. They want to wipe out the history of notorious Nottoway Plantation. But they will not succeed, because Nottoway Plantation in America and Elmina Slave Dungeon in Ghana, they are in the books of remembrance. And when the time comes for the Lord to judge the Gentiles, the Gentile horns, the angels of Elohim, they will remember Elmina Slave Dungeon and Nottoway Slave Plantation. Thank you for watching this video. The Hebrews went through the afflictions unprecedented. It didn't happen in Germany. It happened in Africa. It happened in America and all the four corners of the earth. And they should tell you who truly are the chosen of God, the Hebrew Israelites, who went through the curses in Deuteronomy chapter 28. My email is raptureafrica@yahoo.com. I'm leaving it.